Texto. Imagine stepping aboard something that felt less like an aircraft and more like a floating palace. A machine so vast, so luxurious, and so ahead of its time that even today, more than 80 years later, it seems almost impossible that it actually flew. And yet it did. For a brief, extraordinary window of history, passengers crossed the Atlantic Ocean, not crammed into narrow seats, not fighting for overhead space, but reclining in private cabins, walking through carpeted corridors, dining at set tables, and gazing out at the open ocean from panoramic windows that made the horizon feel like something personal. This is the story of the Latécoère 631, the largest flying boat ever built in Europe at the time of its first flight, a six-engine leviathan of the skies that became, for a few years, the most extraordinary way any human being had ever crossed the Atlantic. And then, with a quiet and terrible finality, it vanished. This video is going to take you inside that aircraft, not into its engines, not into its technical drawings, but into the experience of being a passenger aboard it. What you saw when you walked through its door, what you heard when those six engines rumbled to life over the water, what it felt like to sit down to dinner while the clouds moved slowly past the glass beside your table. And it is going to tell you why this aircraft, despite everything it represented, despite all the elegance and ambition and engineering poured into it, ultimately disappeared from the world in circumstances that are still sobering to consider. Stay with us until the end, because the final chapter of this story is the one that changes everything you thought you understood about luxury and fragility and the cost of dreaming too large. Let us begin with a question. What would it mean to you, truly mean to you, to fly across an ocean in 1,947 inches, something that felt more like a suite at the Ritz than a seat on a plane? The year is 1942, and France is occupied. The country that had once led the world in aviation elegance, the country that had given the world some of the most beautiful aircraft ever conceived, is living under conditions of extraordinary hardship and uncertainty. And yet, in the south of France, in the workshops of the Latécoère company, work continues on something breathtaking. The Latécoère 631 is being finished. It has been in development since the late 1930s, born from a French government contract to create a commercial flying boat capable of crossing the South Atlantic with passengers in a standard of comfort that would rival the great ocean liners of the era. The brief, in other words, was not merely to build an aircraft. It was to build a civilization in the sky. Pierre-Georges Latécoère was a man who had always understood aviation as something more than engineering. His company had built the legendary Aéropostale mail routes, the lines that sent pilots like Jean Mermoz and Antoine de Saint-Exupéry over the Andes and across the South Atlantic in the 1920s and early 1930s. There was a romance to that tradition, a sense that the sky was a stage for human courage and human beauty. The Latécoère 631 was meant to be the culmination of all of that, the aircraft that would carry passengers, not just male and daring pilots, into that same extraordinary space above the water. When the aircraft was finally complete, what existed was something almost implausible. The Latécoère 631 had a wingspan of over 50 meters. That is more than 160 feet from tip to tip. It was powered by 6 Wright Cyclone engines, each producing over 1,600 horsepower, arranged in pairs along a high-mounted wing that gave the aircraft the appearance of something designed by someone who had decided that the sky was simply not large enough for ordinary ambitions. The hull was deep and wide and built to accommodate not the compressed, efficient interior of a modern airliner, but a genuine floating environment, a world within a world, in which passengers could spend the long hours of an ocean crossing in something approaching real comfort. Can you imagine boarding an aircraft in the late 1940s and finding what the passengers of the Latécoère 631 found? Because what was inside that hull was not seats arranged in rows. It was cabins, private cabins with berths, so that passengers could sleep properly over the course of a crossing that could last anywhere from 12 to 18 hours depending on the route and the winds. The aircraft was configured to carry up to 46 passengers in conditions that had no comparison in commercial aviation at the time. There was a central dining saloon where meals were served at properly laid tables. There were dedicated spaces for relaxation. There were large windows, generously sized by any standard, through which the ocean could be observed in that particular way that only a flying boat makes possible, close to the water, viscerally aware of the surface beneath you, yet suspended above it in a state of extraordinary grace. The most surprising thing is not that this aircraft was beautiful. The most surprising thing is that it actually entered commercial service, that real passengers boarded it at the Biscarrosse Lake in southwestern France, that real stewards served real meals, that real travelers settled into real berths and slept above the Atlantic. Air France operated the Latécoère 631 on its transatlantic routes beginning in 1947, and for a period, however brief, it was the most prestigious way any civilian could cross the ocean by air. Now think about what it would have meant to be one of those passengers. The year is 1947 or 1948. You arrive at the departure point and you board not through a jet bridge at a glass terminal, but through a hatch in a massive hull down at the level of the water, with the smell of the lake or the sea around you and the sound of the 6 engines warming up above. The aircraft taxis out onto the open water, and then, in a long rolling takeoff run that sends spray flying past the windows, it lifts free of the surface and begins to climb. And once it is airborne, once the coast of Europe has slipped behind you and the Atlantic opens up ahead, you are in a world of extraordinary stillness and dimension. This is where one begins to understand that this was a different way of traveling. The noise of 6 piston engines at cruise power is considerable. There is no pretending otherwise. But within the hull, it was managed by insulation and by the sheer mass of the structure around you. Passengers could converse at a normal level. They could read. They could walk the length of the interior, which was no small distance. They could watch through the windows as the light changed over the water, as clouds built and dissolved on the horizon, as the color of the ocean shifted from the green of the continental shelf to the deep and lightless blue of the open Atlantic. And then there was the food. Because this was a French aircraft operated by a French airline, and because the passengers it was designed to attract were people of means and expectation, the standard of service on board was something quite serious. Meals were prepared and served with the kind of attention that belonged to good restaurants, not to catering operations. The wines were French. The presentation was proper. If you were crossing the Atlantic in 1947 and you had the means to board the Latécoère 631, you were not being asked to tolerate the crossing. You were being offered the crossing as an experience in itself, as something worth having, rather than simply worth enduring. If you are finding this remarkable, if this is the kind of story that reminds you why the history of aviation is really the history of human aspiration, please consider subscribing to this channel. There is a great deal more of this kind of story here, and every single video is built around the same conviction that the most extraordinary thing about historic aircraft was never the machinery. It was always the experience. Now let us go a little deeper into what made the Latécoère 631 so unusual, because there are details about this aircraft that, when you understand them properly, make the whole story feel even more extraordinary and ultimately even more poignant. The configuration of the interior changed over the aircraft's operational life, but the essential philosophy never did. This was an aircraft designed around the understanding that a crossing of the Atlantic by air was, in the late 1940s, still an event. It was not a commute. It was not routine. It was something that required preparation and resolve and a certain spirit of adventure. Even in the most luxurious possible circumstances, the designers and operators of the Latécoère 631 understood this, and they designed accordingly. They understood that their passengers were people who had probably crossed the Atlantic before on ocean liners, people who were accustomed to the idea that a transatlantic crossing was a significant thing, a thing that deserved a proper setting, proper food, proper sleep, and proper service. The sleeping arrangements deserve particular attention because they represent something genuinely remarkable for their era. The berths on the Latécoère 631 were real berths, properly made up, with sheets and pillows, in the tradition of the sleeper cars on the great European railway expresses or the first-class staterooms on the ocean liners, the idea of sleeping across the Atlantic in an aircraft, of closing your eyes over the ocean and waking up with the other shore approaching, was in 1947 something that carried an almost surreal quality of luxury. Today we have business-class lie-flat seats and we barely think about them. In 1947, on the Latécoère 631, you could sleep properly above the Atlantic, and that was something that very few people in the world had ever done, or would ever do. The windows of the aircraft were another element that deserves to be imagined properly. Flying boats have a relationship with the water and the horizon that land planes do not. Because they fly lower, because their geometry brings the passenger closer to the surface, because the light that comes through the windows is the light of the open ocean rather than the light of the upper atmosphere, there is a visual intimacy with the crossing that is completely different from what you experience in a conventional aircraft. On a clear day over the Atlantic, the view from the passenger windows of the Latécoère 631 must have been something of an almost contemplative quality. The vast surface of the ocean laid out below you, the curve of the horizon apparent in every direction, the sky above enormous and full of weather and light. It was, in the most literal sense, a view that almost no one in history had ever seen, and that the passengers of this aircraft were among the very first to see regularly, in comfort, over the course of a crossing. This is the moment to pause and ask yourself what it would feel like to be one of perhaps 40 people in the entire world who, on any given day, were having that experience. Because the Latécoère 631 was never a mass transportation device. It was a rare thing, operated on limited routes, carrying limited numbers of passengers for a limited time. To have been aboard it was to be among a very small and specific group of human beings who got to know what that felt like. And now that group is gone, and the aircraft itself is gone, and the experience is gone, and the only way to reach it is through stories like this one, which brings us to the third act of this story, and to the part that changes everything. Because the Latécoère 631, for all its magnificence, for all the elegance of what it offered and the ambition of what it represented, had a dark history that cannot be separated from its beauty. Between 1948 and 1955, 3 Latécoère 631s were lost. 3 of these extraordinary aircraft, 3 flying palaces, went down over the ocean, taking their crews and passengers with them. The causes were not always definitively established, which is in some ways more disturbing than any single clear explanation would be. The Atlantic is not a forgiving environment, and the 1940s and early 1950s were a period in which the operational demands placed on large flying boats were sometimes beyond what the technology and the meteorological knowledge of the time could reliably support. The first loss came in 1948 during a commercial flight. It was a catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the small world of people who knew and cared about this aircraft, but it did not end the program. The Latécoère 631 continued to fly, and then there were further losses, and with each one the shadow over this beautiful machine deepened. The most sobering thing to consider is this. The people aboard those aircraft when they were lost were not abstractions. They were passengers who had done exactly what we have been describing, who had walked through the door of this flying palace, who had settled into their cabins, who had eaten dinner over the ocean, who had perhaps slept for a few hours in their berths while the 6 engines carried them through the night, and then, at some point over the water, something happened, and the aircraft was gone. There is something in that sequence of events that is almost unbearable to contemplate. The contrast between the luxury and the quiet and the beauty of the experience as it was designed to be, and the sudden, irreversible violence of the sea reclaiming the aircraft, is as stark a contrast as aviation history offers. The Latécoère 631 was not a warplane lost in combat. It was not an experimental aircraft pushed beyond its limits by a test pilot who understood the risk. It was a commercial airliner carrying paying passengers who had every right to expect to arrive, and it failed them. By the mid-1950s, the era of the great flying boats was ending in any case. The development of long-range land planes, the improvement of airports around the world, and the enormous cost of operating and maintaining large flying boat fleets meant that the economics had turned decisively against aircraft like the Latécoère 631. Air France, facing the losses and the costs and the changing competitive landscape, withdrew the type from service. The surviving aircraft were eventually scrapped, not preserved, not put into a museum, not honored in the way that a machine of such extraordinary ambition perhaps deserved, scrapped. Today there is not a single Latécoère 631 inches existence. There is no cockpit you can sit in, no cabin you can walk through, no berth you can run your hand across. The aircraft exists only in photographs, in technical documents, in the memories of the very few people still alive who saw one, and in stories like this one. The largest flying boat ever built in Europe, a machine that offered its passengers a standard of experience that in some respects has never been equaled in the history of commercial aviation, is gone without physical trace. If this story moves you, if the combination of the beauty and the ambition and the loss touches something in you, please share this video with someone who cares about history, about classic aviation, about the idea that there were moments in the past when human beings tried to make something truly extraordinary and paid a heavy price for it. And please leave a comment telling us which part of the Latécoère 631 experience you would most have wanted to live. Would it have been the takeoff run across the water, the 6 engines roaring, the spray at the windows? Would it have been dinner at a proper table above the open Atlantic? Would it have been closing your eyes in a real berth and knowing that when you open them, the other shore would be closer? Whatever your answer, we want to hear it. And if you have not already subscribed, now is the moment. This channel exists to bring you exactly these kinds of stories. The ones where history and luxury and loss meet in a way that no fiction could invent. The Latécoère 631 lasted barely a decade in the world. Its commercial service was shorter still. It killed people. It was scrapped without a monument, and yet it was, for those who were aborted in the right moments, one of the most remarkable things a human being could experience in the 20th century. The feeling of crossing the Atlantic in what was, without exaggeration, a flying hotel in an aircraft of magnificent proportions, served by attentive crew, fed by a French kitchen, rocked gently by the rhythms of the sky, with the whole vast theater of the ocean laid out below the windows. That experience is gone. The aircraft is gone. The era that made it possible is gone. But the question it leaves behind is the one we should probably all sit with for a moment. How much of what we call progress is really progress? And how much of it is simply the replacement of one kind of extraordinary with something faster and cheaper and altogether more ordinary? The Latécoère 631 was not practical. It was not efficient. It was not safe enough, as history proved with terrible clarity. But it was, for a brief and unrepeatable window of time, one of the most beautiful ways any human being has ever traveled. And sometimes, beautiful things deserve to be remembered exactly as they were, without apology and without pretense, as a reminder of what human beings are capable of when they decide that the journey itself is worth everything.